B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, March 11th, 2019. And in a moment of truthiness, the New York Times is reporting that over 2 weeks ago, the corporate media reports in this country about the showdown over humanitarian aid that the U.S. was trying to force into Venezuela included some false reporting. Now, let us salute the Times for this moment of accuracy. Late on Saturday, apparently too late to make the print edition of the big Sunday newspaper, the New York Times posted a video and a companion article saying that the video contradicts the claim that was widely reported without challenge in the U.S. media based on jaundiced claims by members of the Trump administration that on February 23rd, that Saturday, when we were trying to force a convoy, or do you want to call it a caravan, of so-called humanitarian aid across the border from Colombia into Venezuela, on that bridge that has been closed for years. But the U.S. media shows pictures and makes it seem like Nicolas Maduro recently ordered it blocked. And after the scene led to the torching of one or more of the tractor-trailer rigs that were supposed to have food and medicine in them, Mike Pence put up on Twitter, "The tyrant in Caracas danced as his henchmen burned food and medicine. The State Department released a video saying Maduro had ordered the trucks burned." And Venezuela's opposition held up the images of the burning trailer, reproduced on dozens of news sites as evidence of Maduro's cruelty. Now, this is yellow journalism. And to its credit, the New York Times kind of worked out the yellow. But it took them 2 weeks. And it was only a day after the event on that bridge that Max Blumenthal and his reporters at the Gray Zone made the point that it was opponents of Maduro who threw the Molotov cocktail that torched it. And I've linked to the Times report. They go through the video in great detail. And they show that one protester, hurled 2 Molotov cocktails. One that fizzled out, the other one apparently more successful. Also, the claim about medicine on the truck, well, there were face masks and gloves, soap and toothpaste, but apparently no medicine. Yet that is a claim that has persisted, and it infects the Times reporting to this day, as I will demonstrate in a minute or two. And let's go to Glenn Greenwald. And honestly, that's where I first heard about the New York Times story. Greenwald, apparently writing late at night or all night long, had a piece up by Sunday morning that caught my attention. And he notes the false flags and the other contrived events that have been used to get us into the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the war in Iraq. And he says this was exactly the tactic used February 23rd when the narrative shifted radically in favor of those U.S. officials who want regime change in Venezuela. Images were broadcast all over the world of trucks carrying humanitarian aid, burning in Colombia on the Venezuela border. And then the chorus of voices who took to Twitter, Marco Rubio, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, the head of USAID, Mark Green. They spread false information. And it's hard to believe that they didn't know that they were doing exactly that. Marco Rubio tweeted, "Each of the trucks burned by Maduro carried 20 tons of food and medicine. This is a crime, and if international law means anything, he must pay a high price for this." Then we have more tweets. John Bolton, masked thugs, civilians killed by live rounds, and the burning of trucks carrying badly needed food and medicine. This has been Maduro's response to peaceful efforts to help Venezuelans. It's a Trojan horse. And this language in these tweets, we don't know that Dick Cheney ever used Twitter. But this is his kind of propaganda. Mike Pompeo. We denounce Maduro's refusal to let humanitarian assistance reach Venezuela. What kind of sick tyrant stops food from getting to hungry people? The images of burning trucks filled with aid are sickening. Back to Greenwald. CNN led the way in not just spreading these government lies, but independently purporting to vouch for their truth. On Sunday, February 24th, the report, a CNN team saw incendiary devices from police on the Venezuelan side of the border ignite the trucks. And so we see CNN often very aggressively and amiably advancing the propaganda of government officials from the United States. They want to cheerlead us into a new war in Venezuela, I guess. And so, momentarily, I congratulate the New York Times for a moment of honesty and for calling facts out as they are. But Greenwald notes that people like Blumenthal and others from the Gray Zone Project and others who are critical of the narrative established by the government, embraced by most Democrats, amplified by our media. Maduro bad, U.S. good. Regime change, inevitable. And certainly understandable because the socialists have so badly mismanaged the economy in Venezuela. They need good capitalist neighbors to come in and set things straight. And this is a problem that infects our media across the board. The critics of Russiagate are not permitted to air their views on national media, whether it's broadcast or print. And when it comes to issues that the mainstream media has been promoting relentlessly, like Russiagate, no, we can't allow any critics of that to be quoted in the corporate media. And what is my listener Paul Elsesser wants us to call it, the Ministry of Corporate Propaganda or something like that. So the reason I can only claim that the New York Times had this moment of lucidity is that the coverage continues. Here's the headline: Venezuela blackout in its second day threatens the hungry and the critically ill. Now, they're really amping up the idea that this blackout is all Maduro's fault, and it's because of socialism that the hydroelectric plant and the Venezuelan grid are falling apart. And for the purposes of rejecting claims, the Times does report that Maduro believes that this was the result of cyber warfare. And the way that Marco Rubio was gloating about the blackout as soon as it was announced, well, that's not conclusive. It's only circumstantial, but it persuades me. Then you got Elliot Abrams, who denies. He said, the United States did not bear any responsibility for the blackout, whether direct or indirect, through the sanctions it has imposed on the country. Well, are they even asking the tough questions about how this happened and why, and if this was a false flag event aimed at stoking those who support regime change? And that is a theory that is pretty easy to see would be credible and logical under these circumstances. Another bite from Greenwald. He was on the Twitter machine, saying, I'm still somewhat mystified about how Tony Podesta, intimately involved in many of Paul Manafort's slimiest and most unscrupulous practices, has just vanished from the news cycle in apparently legal jeopardy. And this is triggered by the sentencing of Paul Manafort in one of his venues. There's another sentencing of Manafort later this week. And while I've heard a lot of complaints about the light sentence given to Paul Manafort, I think it's important to note that the judge in that case, as weird as he is, Judge Ellis, I think properly noticed that Bob Mueller was using the tax evasion and other scams of Paul Manafort to squeeze him to participate in Russiagate, to turn on Trump. And he wasn't willing to allow his court to be used for that purpose. On another front, Bob Dreyfus, a man who I've known for 10 or 12 years and I have a high regard for. He published a piece at Tom Dispatch that was picked up as well at consortiumnews.com. Headline, "The Trump administration is reckless enough to turn the Cold War with Iran into a hot one." Now, as I mentioned, Bob Dreyfus has been writing about foreign policy and foreign affairs for a long time. To his credit, in 2016, he and his wife published a series of articles at The Nation critical of Hillary Rodham Clinton's foreign policy, particularly in her role as Secretary of State. Bob and I don't agree on Russiagate. He's been writing a lot of articles at The Nation on that topic over the last year or so. But I think his piece is well worth reading. Are Trump, Netanyahu, Crown Prince MBS, all severely weakened at home and with few allies abroad, reckless enough to set off a war with Iran? He adds some questions. Could military actions designed to be limited trigger a wider war? And he says the answers are yes and yes. Iran is the likeliest spot for Washington's next shooting war. And with all of the commentary coming from Pompeo and Bolton, this could set off a conflict with potentially catastrophic implications. Such a war could quickly spread across much of the Middle East, not just to Saudi Arabia and Israel, but Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and various Persian Gulf states. Bob Dreyfus has been to Iran. I interviewed him about that maybe about 6 years ago. And I think he maintains some good sources inside the country. And he notes that there is a divide in the Democratic Party as some who kind of submitted to Obama's negotiation of the peace plan with Iran, the nuclear agreement, are now free to oppose Trump's withdrawal from the agreement, but Eliot Engel, Senators Bob Menendez and Ben Cardin, they all are hawks on Iran. So I put this out for your consideration and invite you to read it. It's a little too long to quote too much more from, but I think that they make some really strong comments here. He notes that Prime Minister Netanyahu was heard remarking that Israel and its Arab allies want war with Iran at that meeting in Warsaw last month, where he was a little too blunt. Then he, let's see, here's a quote. In Hebrew, he said, "This is an open meeting with representatives of leading Arab countries that are sitting down together with Israel in order to advance the common interest of war with Iran." He later changed the translation of war to combating Iran, but I think we know what Netanyahu means by that. We'll have more on Netanyahu and his re-election campaign being meddled in by the United States coming up shortly here on the podcast. Over the weekend, an interesting story in the New York Times regarding the reports that Kim Jong-un and North Korea have been busy rebuilding some of their nuclear test facilities and missile launch sites. And as I look at this, I think it's healthy to be skeptical of the coverage and ask, is this good intelligence? And I have to say that the satellite photos seem to be showing this activity. Or is it the deep state trying to scuttle the signature foreign policy move by Trump so far? And as you know, I have mixed feelings. I think that Trump has elevated Kim Jong-un to a stature he didn't deserve. And I think that Kim is playing Trump, and this could be evidence of that. But in the middle, we have to remain wary of the sources of this information and the way it is being used. So on Friday, I kind of closed a chapter on the Ilhan Omar controversy that surfaced over the way her tweets were misinterpreted and she was smeared as anti-Semitic again. And on Friday, Politico published an interview. It was actually a kind of side-by-side looking at Ilhan Omar and the moderate Democrat, a guy named Phillips, who is from the adjacent district in Minnesota. And let me start with some of the way this was spun. I'm looking at a blog post at Vanity Fair, where they say that even as the Twitter commentariat continues to litigate whether Omar's latest comments about Israel were poorly phrased or fully anti-Semitic, and that's loaded right there. There was nothing fully anti-Semitic about any of her comments. Anyway, she ignited another controversy Friday when Politico published part of an interview in which Omar appeared to bash Barack Obama. Now, keep in mind, as we're going to review here in a little bit of detail, the quotes here in Vanity Fair and at Politico insert Obama into comments that Ilhan Omar made. But in looking at the Politico interview, there are no direct quotes where she mentions Obama by name. So let me cite this at some length. The voice of Ilhan Omar: I think you endanger your majority by not doing what got you into the majority. And this is something that Republicans often are in tune with and Democrats are not. We seem to be afraid of our own shadow. We've become too afraid, I think, to actually listen to the people and recognize who our base is. I'm fascinated by Republicans. They seem to have, for good or bad, a full understanding of their base and complete loyalty to them. We have a bigger base, but we seem to not understand them or have loyalty to them. Later, she said, as she saw it, the party ostensibly committed to progressive values had become complicit in perpetuating the status quo. Omar says that the hope and change was a mirage. Now, Politico inserts offered by Barack Obama outside of her quotes. Continuing here, recalling the caging of kids at the U.S.-Mexico border and the droning of countries around the world on Obama's watch, and again, those quotes do not include the Obama's watch part. So we weren't there for the interview, and I can't tell if she was talking about the kind of continuity of government going back as far as Reagan and how this has played out. And over the weekend, she tweeted and then deleted a comment where she felt the reporter was unfair, and she linked to an audio recording that she made of their interview. Then reporters jumped on her and said, well, that audio recording proves that you were quoted correctly. Again, I cannot divine that from the information available to me. And I want to point out that listener Ford Green spent a lot of time over the weekend trying to find the original video of Omar's remarks at the Busboys and Poets event, where she talked about the demand on her of loyalty to Israel. That was then twisted into this vile anti-Semitic slur that she was saying all of the Jewish members of Congress have dual loyalty. She never said that. So, quoting again from the Politico piece, we can't only be upset with Trump. His policies are bad, but many of the people who came before him also had really bad policies. They were just more polished than he was. And that's not what we should be looking for anymore. We don't want anybody to get away with murder because they're polished. We want to recognize the actual policies that are behind the pretty face and the smile. Now, as you know, I've been sharply critical of Barack Obama on many issues. And I happen to agree with her. This is politically inconvenient, politically incorrect in the view of many mainline Democrats, but she appears to address that concern here. I don't believe that tiptoeing is the way to win the hearts and minds of the people. I get saddened by some of my freshman colleagues who can't understand that within their districts, the idea of Medicare for all is extremely popular. The Green New Deal is a very popular idea in their districts. Making sure that we have a final fix to our broken immigration system is very popular. What they pay attention to is the rhetoric that says, this is a red to blue district and you have to be careful. You can't talk about these policies. Well, in reality, these people are like everyone else. They struggled with the cost of health care. They struggle with broken infrastructure. They struggle with having an economy that brings them into the 21st century. And we have to be willing to have those conversations. As much as other people are uncomfortable, I'm excited about the change in tone that's taken place. It's extremely positive. The insightful conversations that we're having about money and its influence in Washington, and my ability, I think, to agitate our foreign policy discussions in a way that many of my colleagues who've been anti-intervention, anti-war have been unable to do in the past. So I'm okay with taking the blows if it means it will ignite conversations that no one was willing to have before. Ilhan Omar, I salute you. And I don't know what happened with your recording and their recording, but what I heard you say certainly resonates with me. Now, one of the things she also told Politico is that she's a little queasy about impeaching Trump because of Vice President Mike Pence. But over at the New Yorker, Adam Gopnik did an interesting piece where he talks about the pros and cons, that Jerry Nadler at the Judiciary Committee with those 81 subpoenas or requests for documents that he sent out is essentially a pre-impeachment impeachment approach. Then they talk about the cons and how conservative Democrats are afraid that it would create a backlash that could go on well beyond the Trump era. But I believe that, as you know, impeaching Trump is mandated by his criminal behavior, and I'm referring to obstruction of justice and corruption, as you know, not so much the Russiagate thing. And I believe that impeaching Trump, even if you don't succeed in removing him, would weaken him, and if he did resign and Pence took over, Pence would be on a leash until at least 2020, and I think it would make it harder for him to win in his own right. But Adam Gopnik concludes, the arguments against impeachment today are primarily pragmatic. The arguments for it, primarily principled. But the principled course could, before long, turn into the only practical course. Impeachment may be too good for Trump. It may yet prove just the thing for the country. And, as you can tell, I agree with that point of view. I promised more about Netanyahu. The New York Times reporting giant campaign billboards went up in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem a month ago showing Netanyahu and Trump shaking hands and grinning under the words, a different league, implicitly dismissing Netanyahu's challengers as amateurs, second rate. And get this, today the Pentagon announced a small temporary American troop deployment in Israel. What? By Wednesday, Netanyahu had circulated a video and snapshots showing him surrounded by American troops. That must have been a week ago, and this is the first I've heard of it. What the hell are we doing deploying troops in Israel? We are meddling in the election of a foreign nation. That's what we're doing there. And so far in the U.S., Netanyahu's alliance with the racist Israeli fringe party, the Kahana Group, according to the Times, is freeing Democrats to denounce him with fewer concerns about Republican blowback. That hasn't reached my eyes or ears so far. Very little has been mentioned about Netanyahu's right-wing deal with the devil. And Israel's president has hit back at Netanyahu after Bibi said, in reference to the country's Arab minority, that Israel is not a state for all its citizens. Now, he helped ram through the law that many people call apartheid, the nation-state law passed last year. And the President, Reuven Rivlin, said, these are entirely unacceptable remarks about the Arab citizens of Israel. There are no first-class citizens, no second-class voters. We are all equal in the voting booth. Well, that's a nice notion, but I don't think it's true in daily life. And at the Electronic Intifada, a great report advancing the work of the New Yorker, including Ronan Farrow and his colleague, who exposed the Psy Group, a defunct Israeli private intelligence firm populated by former Mossad and other intelligence agents. Well, they appear to be behind a group called Outlaw BDS that sent threatening letters to those who support BDS. And we're told that the company ceased operations last year. But They had raised $1.2 million to conduct dark web surveillance, in-person intimidation, online blacklists, and smear campaigns against Palestinian rights activists. And this is no different than what Ilhan Omar was subjected to by members of Congress, including members of her own party, last week. And as we have cited, the suppressed Al Jazeera documentary called The Lobby uses a hidden camera reporter to show how these tactics are used to regularly smear opponents of Israel at universities, supporters of BDS, also at universities and in the general population. And the U.S. doesn't do anything to keep these foreign operatives from sowing discord here in our country. And I intentionally use the language that's applied to Russiagate, hoping that that will trigger that kind of recognition from you and anyone else who hears this podcast. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work with your subscriptions to the PBC podcast. Great folks like Suzanne Bowen, Aidan McAleer, Ray Lutz in San Diego, and Benny Alto in Oregon. I appreciate your support, and I encourage others to join in. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com. You click on menu, then click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page. It's easy to make a choice. And I've still got bonus books for you. Dr. Justin Frank's Trump on the Couch, available for a new annual subscription and a mailing address in the continental U.S. BuzzFeed has a great piece today about how Trump ordered last year the expedited deployment of biometric verification. And they are using facial recognition aimed at covering 100% of all international passengers by 2021. They're now collecting fresh photos at the airport, and you may not know it, but you're allowed to opt out of this just like the shirt-off body scanner if you don't want to use that. It's in the fine print. And the airlines are collaborating, collecting these pictures of passengers as they're boarding. And there is no regulation of facial recognition by the government or by anybody in the U.S. so far. And courts have not ruled on whether it constitutes a search under the Fourth Amendment to take your picture. So next time you fly internationally and you arrive back in the U.S., see if you don't mind opting out of that fresh picture for Homeland Security. They've already got plenty of pictures of you. You can count on that. Republicans are scheming to get cases to the Supreme Court now that they have an additional Catholic, Brett Kavanaugh, as a justice. In Georgia and Tennessee, they are moving to enact these abortion laws called fetal heartbeat. They're basically saying, and we think that occurs at somewhere between 6 and 10 weeks, that abortion cannot occur after that heartbeat is detected. And I just note with sorrow that the Democrats no longer champion abortion rights as a central plank of their platform. And this gets even more important because the Republicans have been very successful since Trump was installed at packing the federal courts, not just the Supreme Court, with young, male, white, conservative judges who will be there for a long, long time. And there is more discussion about at least changing the composition of the Supreme Court. Congress, with a Democratic president, could do that. And some of the ideas include expanding the court to 15 justices, and the lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court and shift justices onto lower courts after they serve 14 or 18 years. There's a variety of approaches being considered. Frankly, I think this should be quietly considered until the Democrats achieve the White House and control of both houses, because it will only energize Republicans to pack more right-wingers onto the court. The DNC has announced that Milwaukee will be the site of the 2020 presidential nominating convention at the newly built Fiserv Forum a 17,000-seat arena home to the Milwaukee Bucks. Houston and Miami lost out in that sweepstakes. Beto O'Rourke is making noises. The man who lost the race to take Ted Cruz out of the U.S. Senate from Texas he said he has made a decision. He could announce it as early as this week, and I think that means he's going to run. And I find him a fascinating young candidate, but at a time of identity politics, do we need a young, attractive white male? I don't know. I'm open. I also have concerns about his political positions, some of which can be explained by representing people in Texas and the oil money that he has taken in the past. But I saw that almost 20% of his contributions for the Senate race came from California. And he's been talking more about immigration, education, climate change. Will he be able to find a base and unite the Democratic Party around him? We will wait and see. Politico ran a good piece the other day about the kind of cred and respect that Bernie Sanders has these days among his colleagues in the U.S. Senate. Dick Durbin of Illinois said, back in 2016, because of Hillary, he was seen as a long shot. And as far as 2020 goes, there was a question in Durbin's mind about whether he could, quote, get back up on the bicycle. He went on to say, I know Bernie, I've worked with him, I understand him, people have images of him which may be different than mine, but if you're asking me about Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump, no problem. And the sentiments of other senators are similarly reflected. A couple of quickies. Trump's FEMA has denied reimbursement to California of over $300 million for the repair of the Oroville Dam, which overflowed and the spillway collapsed in February of 2017. And is that payback for our sanctuary policies and the general resistance of California? Maybe. Trump has floated his budget proposal, including an extra $8.6 billion for his border wall. I mean, this just further undermines his claim of a national emergency. It's ridiculous. He also wants to increase defense spending and cut safety net programs used by many Americans. Isn't that beautiful? Last week, I released a podcast with a conversation about what I call California's rogue utility, Pacific Gas and Electric. It's in bankruptcy again, and it's suffering from great liability exposure. And I'm pleased to report that headline on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle today, options abound for PG&E reform. Regulators' critics suggest splitting it into gas, electric, or having the state take over. Those are the headlines. And the article goes on to detail some of the conversations that are underway. And I am mildly optimistic that we may see a major change to the regulatory framework of the utility over the next year or so. And finally, I want to commend John Oliver. He doesn't always get it right. He's dead wrong about Venezuela. But last night, he really spoke to me. He devoted the last portion of his HBO show to attacking robocalls. And while I was preparing today's podcast, when I got to the John Oliver story, my cell phone rang, and it was a robocall from Google. Oh, thank you, Google. I really needed that. And what John Oliver did was he set up a program so that he could robocall every member of the Federal Communications Commission. And I hope he robocalled them repeatedly in foreign languages with offers that they can't resist. And maybe they'll actually do something about it. Thanks for listening. You'll find this podcast on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling